Hello, everyone. Welcome to this educational program by the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the USA, AFPC-USA. I'm Patricia Vasconcelos, a DC Bureau member of the Association, White House correspondent for SBT. On today's program on global trade, the aftermath on Trump's election. The Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the U.S., in partnership with the Hinrich Foundation, invites international journalists, foreign correspondents, to this timely session on the transformative effects of Donald Trump's recent election on global trade. With a new administration starting here in D.C. at the White House in January 20th next year, foreign correspondents for sure are now faced with a new landscape that demands close attention and nuanced understanding. So to help us to better understand this moment, I speak today with Keith Rockwell. He's a senior research fellow at the Hinrich Foundation. Keith, before I properly introduce you with your full bio, what I'm gonna do soon, I just would like to say thank you so much for being here with us and to share your knowledge with our community of foreign journalists based here in the U.S. Welcome.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much, Patricia.
Keith Rockwell, as I said, he's a senior research fellow at the Hinrich Foundation. Prior his retirement in June 2022, Keith served as director at the World Trade Organization, WTO, and spokesperson for the organization for more than 25 years. He also is a global fellow at the Wilson Center. In his former role as director of the WTO's Media and External Relations Division, Keith worked closely with the Director General and his office to reflect the objectives and activities of the WTO. He was responsible for the overall coordination of the WTO's interaction with us, journalists, media in general, civil society, parliamentarians, and the United Nations. He appeared regularly before media at press conferences, briefings, and television and radio appearances. He received his master's in business administration from George Washington University and his bachelor's degree in history and political science from Tufts University. He authored also 1992 and Beyond, How to Prosper in the World's Biggest Market. So again, Kate, thank you so much for joining us in this educational program in partnership with the Hinrich Foundation. We already have our guests here in this panel. So for all of you who are already connected, welcome. Very soon, we are going to have an opportunity for questions. So you can drop your question and I can read them to Kate. So in a broader analysis, Kate, how do you see this recent U.S. presidential election shaping the foreign perception of this country on global trade?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure. How many people are we talking to? Who is?
We have around 150 that already signed for this educational program, and they are joining. Yes.
Great. Oh, terrific. Okay. Well, so the answer to your question is obviously there will be a profound impact, but perhaps not as profound as people might expect, because we've seen this before. Not only did we see this happen in 2017, when Donald Trump became president the first time, but it's extremely important to understand and appreciate that the Biden administration essentially carried on all of the trade policies that were put in place by Donald Trump. In fact, you might even say that the Biden administration was more trade averse than the first Trump administration. Well, they negotiated no trade agreements. They pulled out of the IPEF trade pillar, the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Partnership. The U.S. pulled out of the trade element. They watered it down. They did not lift the tariffs on China. They lifted the tariffs on steel in many cases, but kept in place with respect to the European Union a tariff rate quota that was still hitting them with hundreds of millions of dollars a year in tariffs. They essentially carried on the same position, U.S. position at the WTO. They did not engage in enthusiastic reform of the House. They did not. They pulled out of two elements of the electronic commerce negotiations. They were not engaged in serious discussions on really any issues. So you might argue that the Trump administration, the previous Trump administration, was more active in terms of trade than the Biden administration. Now, they put in place a lot of important pieces of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, the TRIPS and Science Act, the Infrastructure Act, which had trade ramifications and were designed in an extremely complicated way to ensure that the benefits to companies that receive the subsidies would only go to those companies that met the extensive criteria for local content, for example, that they were keeping the Chinese out of the supply chain, all of these things. Now, what can we expect from the second Trump administration? There's a couple of things to keep an eye on. First of all, it seems almost without question that there will be tariffs applied. So then the question to ask is, to what extent? Will it be a 10% across the board tariff? Will it be a 20%? There's a big difference between those two. Will China be hit immediately with 60% tariffs? Will there be a linkage between tariffs and other policy spheres? For example, he's hinted that he would apply tariffs on of 25% on Mexico for all of their exports to the U.S. unless the Mexicans put in place a system whereby undocumented immigrants are restricted, illegal drugs are curbed. He would hold the Mexicans to account there and say, if you don't achieve these aims, you'll be hit with tariffs. The Europeans are very concerned that there might be some links between the war in Ukraine and trade, or beyond the war in Ukraine, U.S. Partnerships in things like NATO, the U.S. commitment to NATO. Is that going to be somehow, will trade be leveraged as a means of or will NATO leadership be leveraged as a means of striking a trade deal? And then the question is, what exactly is the objective of incoming President Trump with respect to these tariffs? Now, he said a few different things. Is he looking to raise revenues? There have been some suggestions that maybe he would cut income taxes, business taxes, to a very large degree, and then replace that lost revenue with duties. That strikes me as a very complicated undertaking, but maybe that's what he has in mind, boosting the federal revenues. Is the idea to try and reduce the trade deficit? Again, that's quite complicated. Trade deficits are not, in essence, they're not really about trade. They're about macroeconomic factors, about supply and demand, and about savings and investment. And if you are consuming more than you're saving, you're going to run a deficit. And that's what happens. Imports get sucked in. As an overall share of the economy, imports are not that big. U.S. is much less trade dependent. Imports and exports together are about 25% of GDP. But nonetheless, there is a not too much of an impact with respect to the overall revenue stream that would come from putting in place tariffs. And if the tariff levels are too high, then you'll simply shut down any imports coming in and you'll get no revenue at all. So that's one question. And maybe that's what he wants, but I think it's probably more likely that what he really wants is to do deals. He likes tariffs. He also really likes doing deals. If he can use the threat of tariffs as a lever to try and prod people into a series of trade agreements, that's what he'll try to do. keeping in mind that if he were in fact to start to put tariffs in place, he would face retaliation. The Europeans have already drafted a list of politically sensitive products, upon which they will slap tariffs immediately after the U.S. acts. And they did this before in the first Trump administration on products like Levi's jeans, Harley-Davidson motorcycles, agricultural products, and Kentucky bourbon, all of them very carefully targeted for key political pinch points in the U.S. system. And they've got another list. It's a closely guarded secret that's on that list, but the products will certainly be of a political nature. The decision to add them to the list will be based on politics more than economics. So this is the question. I mean, what is the objective? If you put in place a 20% tariff across the board, that's going to have an inflationary impact. If it's true that Kamala Harris lost the election in no small part due to people's concerns about inflation, is that really something that President Trump wants to do? Would all of that 20% filter through into the consumers? Difficult to know at this stage. It's difficult to know how they would implement this. I mean, I've heard different people in the administration or in the process of joining the administration say different things. It's very difficult at this stage to know, but keep an eye on what are the overall objectives, what kind of deals is he seeking to do, what kind of linkages might he use that go beyond trade into other important areas like defense and immigration. Now, if it comes to doing deals, I think you'd have to look at each part of the world in a slightly different light. If what they want is if what the Trump administration wants is for other countries to buy more U.S. stuff, well, okay, energy products, liquefied natural gas, agriculture products, those would be obvious candidates of things to buy. They don't seem very interested in services. U.S. sells a lot of services. They're the largest exporter in the world by quite some margin, and they run big surpluses in services. But services don't seem to attract the interest of the president-elect in the same way that, say, steel does. So what might be a more attractive option would be for companies in foreign countries to consider building plants and shifting production to the United States, which a lot of them are considering doing anyway, because energy costs are much lower than, for example, Europe or Japan, because there are all of these subsidies in these programs that the Biden administration passed, and which, in my view, I do not believe the Trump administration is going to throw these programs out. They might make some changes to them, but too many red states are benefiting from these programs. They were very cleverly designed in that way. And I don't think you're going to see members of Congress being too happy if they see, the plug being pulled on a new plant in their district, or a new bridge being built, or whatever it is. So you do see companies in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere very keen to invest. That might be something that he would seek as a result. The one question mark on this is how we would feel about inward investment from China. Because
a lot of things to take a look at, including China and other parts of the world. Just opening up a parenthesis here in what you said about countries opening plans to produce abroad, and you believe that this might continue. I read some analysis before the election in September, and analysts they spoke by that time about their perception about what they would expect from a possible Republican White House, they would say that they expected a harder U.S. line on trade. What is your perception now that we already know that we're going to have a Republican White House starting in January 20th? Are those projections accurate, or do you believe that on trade policy watchers, they can stay calm?
Well, I mean, keep in mind that the whole paradigm has changed since Trump was first elected. 56% of registered voters in the US are in favor of tariffs. Every politician has taken this on board. Finding a free trade coalition in the US right now is a very difficult thing to do. You have some economists, you have some business people, but people are not going around and shouting how important trade is because it's a losing political proposition at the moment. Now, maybe that will change, but certainly, as I said before, the Biden administration was no more trade friendly than the first Trump administration when it came to trade. They said things in a nicer way, perhaps, but they really, if you look at the results, they really didn't do much. I mean, Biden put additional tariffs on Chinese products, additional restrictions. He restricted outward foreign investment from the U.S. to China in the area of tech, which was without precedent. I mean, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., CFIUS, monitors incoming flows, but the Biden administration did not only that, but also kept a very close eye on outward investment. The Biden administration was opposed to Nippon Steel's takeover of U.S. Steel. They had a very, as I say, a very trade-averse approach. So I think you're likely to see this continue. You're going to see a more aggressive, certainly a more aggressive presentation than you saw from the more diplomatic-oriented Biden administration, but the results were actually the same.
Okay. And on U.S. China, that you are already introduced this topic to us, do you believe that U.S. China ties will remain the same, will worsen? How do you see this happening starting next year for the next 4 years?
I think the rhetoric will be much more inflammatory.
This does not mean in reality or the rhetoric. I mean,
it'll be the rhetoric for sure. As I say, Biden was very tough on China, and I don't see Trump paring back any of the tariffs that are in place now. If he wants to slap a 60% tariff in addition to the tariffs that are already in place. Remember, there's $360 billion worth of products that were hit by tariffs in the first Trump administration, and those levels are still there, plus some additional tariffs on things like electric vehicles. I don't see him paring those back. Whether he applies the 60% tariff or not, he said he would. I don't think he would face political resistance from inside the country. In Europe now, when there was a move to put countervailing duties on subsidized exports of electric vehicles, there was a split among the governments in Europe. The Germans and the Hungarians, the Austrians, the Spanish all had reservations about this because they were worried about Chinese reaction to their products, particularly the Germans. Trump isn't worried about this, it doesn't seem. I think the move towards decoupling will continue. And I think that you will see very quickly that the tensions will escalate. One key question to keep in mind is, how would he feel about inward investment from Chinese companies in the US? What if Chinese electric vehicle producers BYD, for example, wanted to set up a production facility in a swing state? Would he go along with that? He might. He has suggested he's open-minded to that idea. That was something that the Biden administration was very keen to avoid.
Mm.
But the Chinese, when it comes to things like electric vehicles, they dominate the supply chain from extracting the essential raw materials to processing them to building the batteries to building the electronics. Every element of the supply chain they dominate. And this is obviously going to be something of interest to Mr. Trump's friend Elon Musk.
Oh, yes, this is something we might talk about as well. But still on China, do you project or see or analyze a United States being more reactive or proactive toward um, China's internal dynamics starting next year?
I think there'll be. I think President Trump will be active.
Active.
I mean, let's see if he really does put the 60% tariffs on, but I wouldn't bet against that. And I don't think you would see anyone raising any serious issues about that. If he puts in place a 20% tariff across the board, you might get congressional pushback. My old colleague, Alan Wolf, a brilliant lawyer on trade matters, he's now at the Peterson Institute, has written a very good legal analysis as to whether the president can simply impose a 20% across the board tariff.
Mm-hmm.
Because as you know, the Constitution puts control of trade policy with the Congress, Article 1.8 of the Constitution. So Allen argues that they can't do this. Um, will that mean that they don't? Not necessarily. I mean, like I say, a lot of the old rules are no longer being followed. So
Mm-hmm.
what will happen is an open question, but it is legally more complicated to simply impose across the board tariffs than to impose tariffs on an individual country or an individual product where the administration can say it's a question of national security. And the courts have proven historically over time to not really want to tie the president's hands on questions of national security.
Mm-hmm. And how do you see the path for the traditional free trade frameworks once the new administration starts?
I think it's a pretty grim prospect for those kinds of agreements. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think you're going to see too much of that. I don't know. They might try to negotiate something with the United Kingdom, uh,
Mm-hmm.
but he's not going to take a soft line. He will insist on full market access, for example, for agriculture, which the UK would find very difficult to accept. So I don't know how that's going to work. Um, as I say, the Biden administration did not show any interest in any trade negotiations with any countries. They just didn't do it. And they said so from the very beginning. You might see him try to negotiate. He likes deals. He likes to do deals. Maybe he would try and do something which would maybe what he would do is go around and suggest that if you don't want to be hit with these tariffs, let's do a trade agreement. Now, I don't think these would take the same shape as traditional trade agreements, covering a very broad swath of economic activity between those two countries, whoever they may be. But it might be a more targeted thing: buy more of our steel, buy more of our agriculture products, invest more in our country. I don't know what the framework would be, but I would not be surprised if he decided that was something he wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. You moments ago you mentioned that you project decisions on tariffs that you believe that they're going to be made based on political alignment rather than economy itself. Is it something that it comes with this new administration, or is it already something that governments in the past they have already been doing like this?
No, no, this is a very big change. In this century, we have not seen this before, but
Mm.
we saw it in 2016 and during the first Trump administration. And then that particular approach to trade has been followed ever since.
Mhm.
Um, the question is whether or not the tariffs are going to be used for a more macro purpose of addressing revenue shortfalls. He wants to continue the massive tax cuts that were first agreed in 2017. I think that comes up for renewal next year. He wants to bring business taxes down further. He's going to look for other forms of raising revenue. And of course, tariffs might be one of these things. I don't know that that's going to be an efficient way to do things. And it probably would not result in an overall decline in the U.S. trade deficit or a narrowing of the trade deficit. But if that is part of what he wants, then that's something to keep an eye on. The other thing is he going to use these tariffs as a means of leverage in terms of striking deals with U.S. trading partners? I would be very surprised if that was not the case. I think that is something he's likely to do. Who would he want to do business with? I'm sure the Europeans. I'm sure the Japanese. I'm sure that the Chinese as well. But let's wait and see.
And from now Asia to Europe, how do you see the implications of the change of the administration here in Washington, D.C. within the European Union, including the new European Commission in Brussels, with the new U.S. government? And if you can add, how do you see Germany in this process, considering the recent collapse of Germany's government and how they intersect with this shifting in U.S. trade stance?
Well, I was in Brussels last week, and I can tell you people there are very edgy. They're worried about what the new administration is going to do. They're worried about trade, of course, but they're far more worried about Ukraine and what this means, what the new administration means for Ukraine, what it means in terms of U.S. commitment to NATO and to the defense of Europe. These are very serious issues for them. In the United States, the issue of Ukraine is seen in a different light. It's seen as a sort of faraway land. It's a little bit esoteric. It's a budgetary burden. This is not the way they view it in this part of the world. It's an existential crisis. Poland shares a very long border with Ukraine. You have 4 or 5 other countries in the EU that share borders with Russia. The Baltics do, Finland. So this is something that they are paying attention to very, very closely. I think that they would be open to doing deals with Trump on the trade side. Whether Trump wants to link the defense of Europe to trade, I don't know. They certainly are considering that this might be something that would happen. But they're also prepared on the trade front to do deals. And I think that they would be very amenable to the notion of having companies invest more here, buying more liquefied natural gas, buying more soybeans or whatever it is, keeping in mind, of course, that these are market economies and the commission cannot tell people what to buy or from whom. These are fairly obvious things they could do. And then, of course, of a more sort of impactful and broad-based response might be to encourage their domestic companies to invest in the U.S., which I think I said earlier, they are inclined to do so anyway. So to benefit from these subsidies from the big industrial policy programs and the much, much cheaper energy in the U.S. Now, Europe is in a difficult position now to confront Donald Trump, not least because of something that you mentioned, which is Germany. Politically speaking, Germany is in a very tense place. Economically speaking, they are hovering above the recession line only just. They are victims of extremely high energy prices. They put their eggs in the basket of Russian natural gas, and that's become obviously more difficult now with the war. So that's a problem. Their economy is very much geared, so to speak, around the production of cars, particularly combustion engine cars. And that model is becoming less and less attractive to governments, to consumers. It's true that demand for electric vehicles has slowed, but the problem is the Germans have taken too long to make the shift in the direction of electric vehicles. And this is a big problem for them. More broadly, Europe does not have the same kind of expertise or competitiveness with respect to tech industries. The biggest and best funded startup that they have is Northvolt, the Swedish electric battery producer. They filed for bankruptcy. So there is a lot of evidence to suggest that the European economy and indeed the political makeup of many of the most important countries is very much in a turbulent place right now. So it's not really, they're not really standing on the most solid ground as they look to face up to incoming President Trump. It's like I say, it's a very tense time in Brussels right now.
And if we have a significant change in the war in between Ukraine and Russia, as he's say that he's gonna, achieve an end for this, do you project any change on sanctions that Russia and Russian institutions have been facing in the past months since the invasion actually started, and how this might affect global trade?
Well, that's a very good question. I'm sure that the Kremlin would seek this. I have no doubt that that's what they would want.
At least the end of some sanctions, you're saying?
Yeah, yeah. I think they would that would be one of the chips on the table of any negotiated settlement, was to alleviate the economic pain that's come as a result of these sanctions. What exactly might be on the table? Is it just to do with investment? Is it to do with trade? Is it to do with movement of persons or seizure of assets? I don't know. I don't know what that might be, but I would imagine that this is something that the Kremlin would like to see altered. Whether that's something that people can accept, I do not know. I guess it would depend on what it is that's being offered for the Ukrainians. It would all come down to a bargaining session. And I've even heard that Kyiv, that President Zelensky, they've all begun to talk about the idea of negotiating something next year. Russia, even though they have taken land, they have paid a terrible price. The estimates are of 700,000 casualties. They've had some of their own territory seized. Whether or not the status quo can be continued, it seems as though we're in a state of stalemate, deadlock. It does seem as though the move towards some kind of a negotiated solution is we're closer to that now than we were 6 months ago. Whether that's a result of Donald Trump coming in or not, I don't know.
And do you project any change on China, or how China deal with Russia having Trump ahead of the White House? We're always talking about economy here.
Yes, I think that the relationship with China will be tense. And as I say, I suspect that that the president-elect will use much more aggressive rhetoric than we have heard from the Biden administration. That's kind of his style. Whether or not they can negotiate some kind of a deal, this is an open question. The deal which they negotiated the last time, the Chinese did not really deliver on their end. And that was a deal which that dispute with the Chinese has had long-lasting ramifications. For example, for U.S. agriculture, the Chinese closed the door on something like 20 billion in U.S. exports, and Trump To offset that, just extended government subsidies to those agriculture producers. In the meantime, Brazil, which, as you know, is an extremely competitive agricultural power, stepped into this void and provided soybeans and all kinds of other farm products to the Chinese, and they've retained those markets. Dislodging Brazilian producers from a market like that is extremely difficult, and to this point has not happened. So there are, when you get involved in these kinds of trade disputes, there are serious downsides, and they have to be considered because people will get hurt, including in the United States.
As you mentioned, Brazil, we just had there the G20. What is your analysis on global trade starting next year with the so-called global south and the alignment and desire of countries from the global south, including Brazil and India, and having business? They are pretty much the leaders. They are pretty much clear when they say that they even think about doing business in another currency. So this is a topic maybe for another educational program, but basically the question is, how do you see what is so-called global south starting next year? And if you also could comment, how do you see the agreements that were defined on economy during this G20, considering that we're going to have a new administration here in Washington, D.C. next year?
Well, I mean, obviously, Brazil, India, South Africa, these are extremely important countries and big players. Certainly when it comes to trade. Brazil is an agricultural superpower. India is a services and tech power. China, of course, a manufacturing power, and a political power and a military power. But of course, these countries, they all have pretty intense rivalries between themselves. India and China have a very tense relationship, as you know, and the Chinese export powerhouse has rubbed other countries the wrong way. Brazil, among other countries, has slapped big time duties on imports of Chinese products like steel, electric vehicles. They have gone, along with Indonesia, to the Chinese. Turkey's done the same thing and said, look, you want to sell these products here? You have to build factories here. Everyone is playing this local content game now, which is contrary to WTO rules, but WTO rules are not being respected by too many countries these days. So this is a problem, but it's the way the world is going now. If you want to mine nickel in Indonesia, you have to process the raw material there before you can export it. That adds value and jobs to the Indonesian economy. So I think basically these economies are important. They do work together on some things. I would not expect to see the dollar's dominance change. Keep in mind that a little under 2/3 of all reserves held in the world today are U.S. dollars. Over half of all trade is conducted in dollars. They can use other currencies, but the dollar is the world's reserve currency for a reason. And the depth and the sophistication of U.S. capital markets is such that I don't see that coming under threat from any of those countries anytime soon. They might use currencies other than the dollar, but at the end of the day, you want to be paid in a currency in which you have trust. And for the moment, anyway, the dollar is that currency. Let's see what happens. There have been some statements made in the past about the dollar, about President Trump wanting to see the value of the dollar driven down. No Treasury Secretary will ever say that. And Scott Bessent has been saying things that are to the contrary, which is what a Treasury Secretary is supposed to say. The dollar is meant to be managed by the Treasury. I think there is an understanding that having the world's reserve currency is, well, I think it was Valéry Giscard d'Estaing who said, it's an exorbitant privilege, and I think it's one that Trump would not want to fritter away.
Before we get into the questions from our audience, we already have questions here. Could you quickly explain for us when you said that many, for example, not many, but the US might say to countries, oh, do you want to produce this? Then do it in your own country. And this would go against WTO rules, considering your largest experience working for the WTO. In a general line, why officially this is not allowed?
Well, because you're not supposed to use trade-related investment measures.
Okay.
You're not supposed to say, if you want to sell this here, you can only do so if you produce it here. If you
Okay.
have local content requirements, you also cannot have export requirements. If you ask a car company to invest, let's say in Brazil, the Brasilia would not be allowed to say, in order for you to make these cars and sell them in our market, you have to export 20% of your total production or whatever it is. That's not allowed under the rules. But right now, the rules are being flouted by everyone. And the dispute settlement system has been crippled, and it's not, the Biden administration did nothing to bring it back. And I would be very, very surprised if the Trump administration made moves in that direction either. I think they will be content to let the system be crippled as it is, and we'll have to just wait to have the serious reform of the organization.
Susan asks, Susan Baca, I hope I'm pronouncing your surname well. Susan, if not, apologies. She asks, what do you think that will be Trump's approach with Canada? And so if you believe that a bilateral trade agreement possible to replace the US-Mexico-Canada agreement.
Right. Well, I know that agreement is up for review. I think it's next year, right? Or is it the following year? Anyway, soon. It's up for review. I have heard President-elect Trump say that he doesn't want to review, he wants to renegotiate. I think the view in Mexico and Canada is not that. It's they would like to have it reviewed, and maybe they could make some minor fixes, adjustments here or there. I don't know what exactly Trump would like to do with respect to this, but he has he's been quite aggressive with Canada. They were among the countries that got hit hard on steel and aluminum tariffs. It wasn't just the tariffs that upset the Canadians. It was the notion that somehow products coming in from Canada would constitute a national security threat. It's whatever it is, a 3,000-mile border, undefended, the largest such border in the world. How can you make this statement of your very close ally? And they found that to be, I think, very, very offensive. I know that Prime Minister Trudeau and Trump have clashed before. I would suspect that Ottawa will be making overtures, friendly, positive overtures to the incoming administration. Whether they are returned and in what way, it's too early to say.
Laurie Baker asks, many people are considering the decision, if it's going to happen, if it's not going to happen, the U.S. departure from NATO. And the question is about this: how would Trump's departure from NATO, if this happens, would impact the economy in the long term?
Boy, that's that. I first of all, I would not expect that to happen. Keep in mind that the Congress in the Biden administration approved by very wide margins legislation that said that the president cannot unilaterally withdraw the U.S. from NATO. It has to be done by a Congress, and Congress would never do that. Having said that, if the president says, as he has said before in rather colorful terms, that he would not defend certain countries, all it takes is the impression in the minds of the allies that they would not be defended for the alliance to be weakened. I think the impact would be largely on Europe, which is, as I said a little while ago, is already facing real hardship in terms of political and economic, the political and economic situation. This would be another blow for them, and it's something that it has them very, very worried.
Mm-hmm. During the campaign, a lot was said about rebuilding the trust in different parts of the country, United States, and the industry to bring jobs back. And do you see this actually happening, and which sectors might be more affected? And if the U.S. starts to see a revitalization in some areas, in certain states, how this might affect the alliances, economic alliances that the U.S. have with international partners.
Well, it's, as you know, you're
not sure, for example, if the new administration is going to invest as much as this administration did in green energy, for example. An agreement was signed in South America last week, just an example.
Yeah, well, in the COP29 agreement.
Yeah.
Whether the Trump administration would feel that they are beholden to carrying out the commitments that were made, I do not know. I know that that Trump has a very different view about green energy than Biden. He's been very critical of solar power, of battery power, wind power. He's been very critical of moves to get away from a combustion engine. He is a friend of the fossil fuel industry. I think that that's something that people are obviously concerned about. The country is polarized on this issue and many others, and I think that that has caused really quite a lot of tension, political tension. It's the lines, the geographical lines separating the parties are rather stark, and I think that there are a great many issues that are, for the American people, extremely difficult for them to reconcile in terms of another position, in terms of the position of their political opponents. This is why Congress has been so paralyzed over the last decade or so, and it hurts the country. It hurts the country in terms of its ability to respond to crises. It hurts the country in terms of its ability to support its allies. So as long as the country is like, but I have to tell you something, it's not only in the U.S. that we see this. We see this in many other parts of the world. In Latin America, we see it now. I mean, if you look at Argentina, if you look at Brazil, if you look at Chile, if you look at the change of governments that they've had there, these were very tense changes of government. Brazil particularly, but also you're seeing now a completely different approach taken to the economy by Buenos Aires. President Milei's view is very, very different to that of his predecessors. In Europe, you're seeing this in a major, major way. Africa, it's a time when people are very much set in their particular way and very much less open to other political or social positions. And in Europe, you see this in a big, big way now. And that's one of the reasons why the far right is making such gains.
We have many questions here. I'm going to try to address as many as possible for you. And if we end our hour without answering everyone, I'm going to forward the questions for Keith after this educational program ends. Keith, James Mathis asks about the tariffs, if reciprocal tariff, if you believe this is an idea. And he also asks about deals bilateral with European Union and members.
Well, yeah, the Reciprocal Tariff Act, this was done by Franklin Roosevelt back in 1934, I think. And in a way, it was trade liberalizing because it sort of replaced the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act that had disastrous consequences. It took 5 years for them to figure that out, but they did. Here is the problem with a reciprocal tariff approach. I'm not sure the exact number, but let's just say conservatively, the number of tariff lines in the United States is 3,500. Okay. And let's say that we have 193 countries in the world. If you're going to make a reciprocal tariff regime, that means you have a different tariff schedule for every country and and within that country, a different tariff schedule for every product, agricultural or manufacturing product produced anywhere in the world. So you have you have 3,500 tariff lines multiplied by 195 countries. It would be a chaotic mess to administer. The poor person at the port of Long Beach, the customs man or woman who has to look at a colored TV coming in and try and determine, did this come from Taiwan? Did this come from Malaysia? Because the tariff line is going to be different. Now, the tariff line on products that are the same, they're the same. It is true that there are circumstances in which certain countries would get different tariff treatment if they participate in a free trade agreement or if they're under sanction or whatever it might be, but you get the point. By and large, if you were to do that, that's one of the reasons why you had the system of the WTO being created, because everyone knew what the tariff line was for each product and coming from each country. If you change that, you're going to have a chaotic system which would be rife with fraud because people would circumvent rules of origin requirements. Because let's say the tariff on TVs from Taiwan is 2% and it's 25% coming from Indonesia, people will try to make it appear as though the product's coming from Taiwan. And that's not that difficult to do given the degree of transshipment that you have these days. A lot of products coming into the U.S. have been manufactured in China, but seem to be coming from Mexico because there's better tariff treatment there. So I think that's a policy that would be extremely difficult to implement effectively. Bilateral trade deals.
Yes, bilateral trade deals, and he asks about, bilateral with European Union members.
Well, I mean, I don't think what we're talking about here is a full-fledged trade agreement like we've seen before, like USMCA. But you might get trade deals that were more specific with a smaller range of products, perhaps. And I know that the Europeans would like to do something. As I say, there's interest in deepening the economic relationship. The extent to which, I mean, remember, these trade negotiations are a two-way street. And so if the U.S. were to be serious about negotiating with the Europeans, they'd have to make concessions too, which I don't know how willing they are.
Thank you so much, James Mathis, for sending your questions. The other two I'm going to forward to Kate. Juka and Lethinen is asking, the United States has struggled in areas such as shipbuilding. Is it possible that allies could be incentivized to participate in strategic industries within the U.S. Through relief instead of tariffs?
I think that would be a very good idea. I know I'm guessing that the questioner is from Finland, where they make the most high quality shipbuilding cranes in the world. And they don't make those in the US. As the questioner rightly says, US shipbuilding has been hampered by a variety of things. including the Jones Act, which insists that only U.S. vessels be used in terms of domestic trades, which cripples the supply of ships and the transfer of technology and a whole host of other issues. I think they would have to look into those things. I think one of the things that I've heard is that they do not want to in any way apply tariffs to products that are not made in the U.S. Because that just makes the price go up, and it doesn't protect the industry. It doesn't really provide much job security. It just makes the price go up. And things like shipbuilding cranes would fall into that category, along with lots of other things like coffee, for example. Is this what they're going to do? I don't know. Would you apply the Reciprocal Tariff Act to products that you don't even make in the country? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. As you can see, this is very complicated territory, and you can't just come in and wave a wand and expect that all of a sudden you'll turn the trade regime around totally. It requires some serious thought and a lot of execution.
We still have time for one more question from James. He sent some questions here for us. He also asked if you believe that will the USTR, the United States Trade Representative appointment, tell us the direction, how things will go?
Well, that's a very interesting question. The statement that came out of the White House when they announced that Mr. Lutnick is the nominee for the Commerce Secretary suggested that the USTR would be basically subordinate to commerce, would be, as far as I read the statement, would be a kind of a branch of commerce in the same way that the Weather Service and the Census Bureau are. There's a problem with that in that the USTR was created by an act of Congress. President Kennedy put the bill to the Congress. It was approved, and it's been in place as a separate entity ever since. Now, there have been attempts to try and push it into other departments, including commerce. There have been attempts to bring it closer into the White House. It's now considered a White House agency. The USTR reports directly to the president. The other issue here, apart from the statutory requirement to preserve this as an independent agency, is the congressional jurisdiction. The committees with oversight of the U.S. Trade Representative are different than those who oversee the Commerce Department. For the USTR, it's Ways and Means and Finance, and it's Commerce for the Commerce Department. But if the president says the Commerce Secretary is the boss, my suspicion is you would get a lower profile person in USTR than you might otherwise get. You would not get a guy like Bob Lighthizer, probably, or Michael Froman. I don't know who they have in mind. I don't know what the situation would be. But if it's no longer an independent agency, then all assumptions that would be made would have to be taken with this would have to be viewed through this prism.
And one last question on Ukraine. We already spoke a lot about Ukraine and Russia. Young Cal is asking, how do you think Trump will end the war in Ukraine? I believe from an economic perspective, maybe which cards they have on the table in order to negotiate.
Well, I don't know. I don't know. There obviously would have to be concessions made on both sides. I'm pretty sure the Kremlin would want to have the sanctions lifted. I think you would probably a key question for Ukraine is going to be how the rebuilding of the country and its economy are undertaken. They've taken a terrible blow there. Who pays for it? How is it done? You have in Europe, for example, as you know, the Ukraine is a huge producer of grain, and the European Union has opened up its market to exports of Ukrainian wheat, and other grains. And this has caused all manner of consternation among agriculture producers in, for example, France and Poland. So what exactly they would be able to do, how trade might play a role in all of this, we'll have to wait and see. But clearly, trade will have an important role. And clearly, if the sanctions were lifted, you would see that a whole range of products from metals to energy to agriculture would be more freely available on global markets.
Anything else you would like to add to us now, specifically talking to, foreign journalists like me that are based here in the U.S., covering U.S. politics and its impact in the world? Anything that we might be more aware starting next year? Any tips, in order to help us in our daily reporting on this matter?
Just a couple of things that I mentioned in the beginning. Try and determine early on what the objective of the tariff policy is. Is it a revenue raising thing, or is it leverage for deals? Maybe it's a little bit of both, but I think the second option is more realistic, is more in line with the way that Mr. Trump thinks. But I mean, tariffs are not a silver bullet. You can't solve all the problems of the country or the world with tariffs. In fact, you're going to create some problems for consumers and for your own producers, who will face, no doubt, retaliation, and for your allies. Keep in mind how that's going to work, and then keep an eye as well on linkages between trade and other very important areas, be they defense, immigration, or whatever they may be.
Keith Rockwell, thank you so much for
Thank you.
Your attention, your time, for being here, available for us for 1 hour and helping us to better understand this topic.
I hope it was useful, and if you want to send me the additional questions, I'll do my best to answer them as well.
You're going to do this for sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, all of you who were here with us in this educational program, The Aftermath of Trump's Election. This educational program, it's in partnership with the Hinrich Foundation. I spoke today with Keith Rockwell. He's a senior research fellow at the Hinrich Foundation, and he served as director at the World Trade Organization and spokesperson for the organization for more than 25 years. Thank you all. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.